Vidkun Quisling's name has become synonymous with betrayal and treachery. Once a promising soldier and diplomat, Quisling's descent into infamy began with his allegiance to Nazi Germany during World War II. As the self-declared leader of occupied Norway, he orchestrated policies of oppression, aided in the persecution of Jews, and betrayed the very people he claimed to serve. His legacy is a stark reminder of the consequences of blind ambition and misplaced loyalty. Through this documentary, we unravel the rise and fall of Norway's most infamous traitor, exploring the choices that led him to his ultimate downfall.
Vidkun Quisling's story began not in infamy but with promise. Born on July 18, 1887, in the quiet town of Fyresdal, Norway, he was the son of a Lutheran pastor. As a young man, Quisling excelled academically and demonstrated a sharp intellect, eventually enrolling at the Norwegian Military Academy. After graduating with top honors in 1911, Quisling quickly rose through the ranks, serving as a military attaché in Petrograd, now St. Petersburg, during the tumultuous Russian Revolution. This experience left an indelible mark on him, fueling his disdain for communism and his belief in authoritarian rule. To many, he was a man destined for greatness. By the late 1920s, Quisling's reputation extended beyond Norway. He worked for the League of Nations and collaborated with humanitarian Fridtjof Nansen to provide relief for famine-stricken areas in the Soviet Union. These efforts earned him admiration, even as whispers of his authoritarian tendencies began to surface. The seeds of betrayal were sown in the 1930s when Quisling co-founded the Nationalsamling National Union Party, inspired by the fascist movements sweeping across Europe. His party's emblem, the Golden Sun Cross, symbolized a twisted vision of national purity. Yet, in a country proud of its democratic traditions, Quisling's ideology found few followers. As Hitler rose to power in Germany, Quisling became an ardent admirer of the Nazi regime. He envisioned a Norway aligned with the Third Reich, seeing himself as the savior of his nation from communism and moral decay. This conviction would soon lead him down a treacherous path. In December 1939, Quisling shocked the world by meeting Adolf Hitler in Berlin. Over a series of meetings, he pledged his loyalty to the Führer and outlined plans for a Nazi-backed coup in Norway. His actions were denounced by his countrymen, but Quisling remained resolute, believing destiny was on his side. On April 9, 1940, Nazi Germany invaded Norway, catching the nation off guard. Quisling seized the opportunity, broadcasting a coup announcement from Oslo's NRK radio station. With a calm but chilling voice, he declared himself prime minister, betraying his people as Nazi tanks rolled through Norwegian streets. His self-proclaimed government was met with widespread resistance. The Norwegian royal family fled to Britain, while citizens rallied behind the king's call for defiance. Quisling's betrayal became a rallying cry for Norwegian patriotism, uniting a nation against its greatest enemy. Despite Nazi support, Quisling struggled to consolidate power. His government was weak, propped up only by German occupiers. While he envisioned himself as Norway's rightful leader, the people saw him as a traitor, a man who had sold his soul to the enemy. By the end of 1940, Quisling's authority was reduced to a puppet regime. Resistance movements grew stronger, sabotaging German operations and spreading anti-Quisling propaganda. His dream of a new Norway under his rule was crumbling. For the next 5 years, Quisling ruled in the shadow of his Nazi masters. His policies of collaboration earned him the hatred of his people. As Allied forces advanced, it became clear that Quisling's days were numbered. The hero had become a villain, and Norway's darkest chapter had begun. Under Quisling's rule, Norway endured brutal Nazi occupation. His government implemented policies that stripped citizens of their freedoms and subjected the Jewish population to persecution. In 1942, Quisling's regime began the deportation of Norwegian Jews to Nazi concentration camps, marking a stain on the nation's history. The betrayal ran deep. Quisling enacted Nazi laws, banned opposition parties, and silenced dissent. Yet, the Norwegian spirit was unbroken. Resistance groups such as Milorg rose to challenge his authority, conducting sabotage missions and aiding Allied forces. Quisling's attempts to enforce loyalty often backfired. His infamous teacher's oath in 1942, which demanded allegiance to his regime, was met with defiance. Thousands of teachers refused to comply, sparking mass arrests but also inspiring national unity against the occupiers. The youth of Norway played a significant role in the resistance. Underground newspapers circulated anti-Quisling messages, while students organized protests. These acts of bravery highlighted the unyielding determination of a nation unwilling to bow to tyranny. Quisling's obsession with power led him to crack down on resistance movements. GESDAPO raids became commonplace, and collaborators were rewarded for turning in their neighbors. Fear permeated Norwegian society, yet it also strengthened the resolve to fight back. In 1943, the tide began to turn. Norwegian commandos, trained by the British, carried out daring missions, including the sabotage of Nazi heavy water production at the Vemork plant. These victories symbolized hope and resilience, further isolating Quisling from his people. As the war dragged on, Quisling's popularity dwindled even among his Nazi allies. German officials saw him as incompetent and overly ambitious. He was a pawn in Hitler's grand strategy, no more than a figurehead with no real power. By 1944, Allied victories in Europe signaled the beginning of the end for Nazi occupation. The Norwegian resistance grew bolder, targeting Quisling's collaborators and disrupting Nazi supply lines. His regime, once propped up by fear, was now crumbling under pressure. Quisling's arrogance blinded him to reality. He continued to believe in his vision of a fascist Norway, even as defeat loomed. To the Norwegian people, his delusion was both infuriating and tragic, a man so consumed by ideology that he could not see his own downfall. The liberation of Norway in May 1945 marked the end of Quisling's reign. Allied forces, along with Norwegian resistance fighters, reclaimed the nation. Quisling was arrested at his mansion in Oslo, his dream of power shattered, his name synonymous with treason. His capture was met with a mixture of relief and anger. For 5 years, Norway had suffered under his collaborationist regime. Now, justice awaited, and the people demanded answers for the betrayal that had cost so many lives. Quisling's trial began on August 20, 1945, in Oslo. It was the most anticipated trial in Norwegian history, drawing crowds eager to see the traitor face justice. In a courtroom filled with tension, Quisling appeared defiant, denying the charges of treason, murder, and collaboration. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Testimonies from resistance fighters, survivors of Nazi persecution, and even former collaborators painted a damning picture. Quisling's radio coup announcement, his Nazi allegiance, and his role in the deportation of Jews left no doubt about his guilt. As the trial progressed, Quisling's composure began to crack. He portrayed himself as a misunderstood patriot, claiming his actions were meant to protect Norway. The court, however, saw through his lies. His attempts to justify his betrayal only deepened the contempt of his countrymen. On September 10, 1945, Quisling was found guilty on all charges. The court sentenced him to death, a decision widely supported by the Norwegian public. For many, it was not just justice, it was a necessary step toward healing a nation scarred by occupation and treachery. In the early hours of October 24, 1945, Quisling was executed by firing squad at Akershus Fortress in Oslo. The execution marked the end of a dark chapter in Norwegian history. His name, once associated with promise, would forever be a symbol of betrayal. The aftermath of Quisling's reign left a complex legacy. Norway emerged from the war determined to rebuild, honoring the resistance fighters who had risked everything to oppose him. Yet, the scars of occupation lingered, a reminder of the cost of complacency in the face of tyranny. Quisling's mansion, where he plotted his rise to power, was turned into a war museum. It stands today as a testament to the resilience of the Norwegian people and the dangers of unchecked ambition. Visitors walk its halls, reflecting on the choices that led a man from hero to villain. In Norway, the name Quisling has become a synonym for treachery. Across the world, it is used to describe collaborators and traitors. His actions and their consequences serve as a cautionary tale about the perils of betraying one's principles and people. The story of Vidkun Quisling is one of tragedy and betrayal, but also of resilience and justice. It is a reminder that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can prevail. For Norway, it is a story of reclaiming freedom and ensuring that the horrors of the past are never forgotten.
All right, so you guys sent in some really fascinating material for this deep dive, and let me tell you, this one is a doozy. We're diving into the life of Vidkun Quisling.
Oh, wow.
A man who went from working with a Nobel Peace Prize winner to literally becoming synonymous with the word traitor.
Yeah. Talk about a fall from grace.
It's just unbelievable. I mean, we're talking about a guy who was fighting famine one minute and then shaking hands with Hitler the next.
Right. It's like a real-life Jekyll and Hyde story.
And that's what we're going to try and unpack today. How did this even happen? How did a man with such a promising start go so drastically off the rails?
Well, I think if you want to understand Quisling, you really have to start with his early years, right? I mean, his background is anything but ordinary.
Yeah, he was a decorated war hero, a brilliant military strategist.
Worked with Fridtjof Nansen.
Yeah, Nansen, like the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Nansen, they worked together on humanitarian relief missions in Russia after the revolution.
Exactly. So you see this incredible compassion, this commitment to helping others.
And then, boom, he's leading a fascist party in Norway and embracing Nazi ideology.
Yeah, that's a head-scratcher for sure.
I mean, talk about a paradox. How do you even begin to reconcile those two sides of the same person? It's almost like you're talking about two different people.
Right, but I think that's the key, isn't it? There are these two distinct phases in Quisling's life.
So where do we see that shift start to happen?
Well, many historians point to his time in Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution as a real turning point.
Okay, so he's witnessing firsthand the chaos, the violence.
The brutality of a totalitarian regime.
Right, so that experience probably left a deep mark on him.
No doubt. It solidified his aversion to communism, that's for sure.
But wouldn't his work with Nansen, fighting famine and all that, wouldn't that have had a counterbalancing effect?
You'd think. Right.
I mean, you're talking about completely opposite worldviews here.
Absolutely. And that's what makes Quisling so fascinating, so perplexing. He seemed to compartmentalize these experiences in a way, like his moral code had blind spots.
So maybe his early experiences with both humanitarianism and the horrors of revolution, maybe they planted the seeds for his later transformation, but they didn't fully explain it.
That's a good way to put it. There's definitely more to the story.
And I'm guessing this is where the rise of fascism in Europe really starts to play a role.
Oh, absolutely. The 1930s saw the rise of these authoritarian movements all across Europe.
And Quisling, he's drawn to that.
He's captivated by it. He sees it as this force for change, this way to restore order and strength.
So in 1933, he founds the Nasjonal Samling, the National Union Party in Norway.
Right, and their symbol, that golden sun cross, it really embodied this idea of national purity, this kind of twisted romanticism that was so central to fascist ideology.
Right, and it's such a stark contrast to his earlier work, right?
It's a total 180.
He goes from humanitarian aid to a symbol associated with, well, exclusion and persecution. And I'm guessing this is where his admiration for Hitler really starts to take hold.
Oh, yeah. Quisling saw Hitler as a strong leader, somebody who could restore Norway to some kind of, imagined former glory.
So he starts to buy into this idea of a pan-Germanic empire.
Exactly. He envisioned Norway aligning with the Third Reich, becoming part of this dominant new European order.
Okay, but what was driving him at this point? Was he purely power-hungry, or did he genuinely believe he was acting in Norway's best interests?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Yeah. And historians are still debating it today. I mean, you have to consider the context. Europe is in turmoil, democracies are seen as weak and failing, and fascism offers this illusion of strength and stability.
Right, so maybe Quisling truly believed that aligning with Hitler was the only way to secure Norway's future.
It's possible. Maybe he was trying to play a dangerous game, trying to position Norway to come out on top in this new world order.
So maybe it was a mix of misguided patriotism
and a dangerous dose of ambition.
Yeah, a toxic cocktail. And no matter his intentions, the consequences were about to become all too real because our sources detail a secret meeting between Quisling and Hitler in December 1939, where they basically map out a Nazi-backed coup in Norway.
Oh, yeah. That meeting was a turning point. It set the stage for what was to come.
And just a few months later, in April 1940, German forces invade.
It was a swift and brutal takeover.
And Quisling, he seizes the moment. He makes this infamous radio broadcast declaring himself prime minister.
Oh, man. Can you imagine being a Norwegian citizen hearing that?
Your own countrymen siding with the enemy.
Yeah. It was a complete betrayal of everything Norway stood for.
And while Quisling may have expected the Norwegian people to fall in line, he seriously miscalculated, right?
Big time. The sources describe widespread resistance from the very beginning. The royal family, they flee to Britain. The king, he issues his call for defiance, and it resonated deeply with the Norwegian people.
So instead of gaining control, Quisling's actions actually fueled the opposition he was trying to suppress.
Exactly. Yeah. Often the way, isn't it? Acts of betrayal, they can galvanize resistance in ways that the perpetrators never anticipate.
So Quisling's grand plan backfires spectacularly. He's alienated his own people, the legitimate government is in exile, and Norway is now under Nazi occupation, with him as Hitler's puppet.
Yeah, it's a dark turn of events, and that's where things really start to get ugly.
Okay, so we've got Norway under Nazi occupation. Quisling's this figurehead leader, but the people want nothing to do with him. What was life actually like for Norwegians during those years?
Well, I mean, it was a pretty dark time. You have to remember, this is Nazi-occupied territory, right?
Yeah.
So you've got the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police running around, cracking down on any kind of dissent.
Freedom of speech? Out the window, I'm guessing.
Gone. Freedom of the press? Nope.
Opposition parties?
Banned. I mean, it was a full-on totalitarian regime. They were trying to reshape Norwegian society in the Nazi image.
So it wasn't just about, like, controlling information?
No.
It was about fundamentally changing how Norwegians lived thought.
Everything.
Yeah.
They imposed strict censorship, replaced textbooks with Nazi propaganda. There was even this attempt to force teachers to swear an oath of loyalty to Quisling and the Nazi regime.
Oh, right. The teacher's oath. I read about that. Didn't that backfire spectacularly?
Oh, yeah. It was a huge blunder on Quisling's part. Thousands of teachers, they just flat out refused to take the oath.
It risked their jobs, their freedom.
Everything. And it sparked these massive protests, arrests. It just deepened the resentment towards Quisling and the whole occupation.
It's amazing how one seemingly small act of defiance could have such ripple effects.
Yeah. It really shows the courage of those teachers, but it also kind of captures the broader spirit of resistance brewing in Norway at the time.
So how did that resistance manifest?
Well, it took many forms.
Yeah.
You had organized groups like Milorg, which was the main Norwegian resistance movement.
Morg?
They were carrying out acts of sabotage, gathering intel for the Allies, helping people escape. They were a real thorn in the side of the Nazis.
So like a secret army operating right under the noses of the occupiers?
Exactly. They were highly organized, divided into cells to minimize the risk of exposure. Secrecy was paramount. They even had training camps hidden away in the mountains.
Sounds incredibly dangerous. Were they successful?
Oh yeah, they were very effective. They disrupted supply lines, sabotaged factories, rescued downed Allied airmen. One of their most famous operations, and this was a real nail-biter, involved the sabotage of the Vemork heavy water plant in 1943.
Heavy water. Remind me what that is again.
So heavy water, it's this a rare form of water, and the Nazis needed it for their nuclear research program.
Right. Atomic bombs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Vemork plant in Norway, it was one of the few places producing it, so it was a high-value target for the Allies.
So the resistance basically snuck in and blew it up.
Well, it wasn't quite that simple, but you're getting the idea.
Yeah.
It involved multiple operations, incredible bravery, and some pretty impressive skiing skills, too.
Really?
Oh, yeah. The first attempt, in 1942, was a partial success, but the Nazis managed to repair the plant. Then in 1943, a team of Norwegian commandos, they were trained by the British, they parachuted in, infiltrated the plant, and destroyed key components. It set back the Nazi nuclear program by months.
Wow, that sounds like something straight out of a movie.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it really happened. Real people risking their lives to strike a blow against tyranny.
And all of this is happening while Quisling's busy trying to prop up his puppet regime.
Yeah, it's almost like he's living in a parallel universe, oblivious to the growing resistance movement that's undermining him at every turn.
It really shows the limits of power, especially when that power is rooted in coercion and betrayal. You can control people with force, but you can't control their hearts and minds. And in the end, that's what matters.
And that's what we see happening in Norway. No matter how much control Quisling tried to exert, he could never extinguish that flame of resistance that was burning in the Norwegian people.
And as the war progressed, that flame just kept getting brighter, right?
Yeah, the tide was turning, the Allies were gaining ground, and the writing was on the wall for Quisling and his regime.
So the war is winding down, the Allies are pushing back, and Quisling's, well, his grip on power is definitely slipping. What happens to him? Does he go down with the Nazi ship?
Well, by 1945, it was pretty clear that Germany was going to lose.
Right.
The Allies were closing in on all fronts, and Norway's liberation was, it was just a matter of time. But Quisling, I guess you could say he was a bit delusional.
Oh, really?
He really clung to this belief that he could somehow salvage his position. He even tried to negotiate with the Germans for a more favorable peace settlement.
He still thought he had bargaining power at that point.
I know, it's hard to believe, right?
It really is. Was he just completely out of touch with reality?
I think it was a combination of things. You have to remember, this is a man who spent years surrounded by people who just told him what he wanted to hear.
Yeah.
Completely isolated from the realities of the war, the suffering he had inflicted on his own people. It's not surprising his perception was, let's just say it was a bit skewed.
So the inevitable happens. May 8th, 1945. VE Day. The war in Europe is finally over. What becomes of Quisling?
He's arrested at his mansion in Oslo.
Poetic, almost.
It is, isn't it? The very symbol of his ill-gotten power becomes the place where it all comes crashing down.
I imagine that must have been a pretty intense time for Norway. Finally free from occupation, but also having to confront, the wounds of betrayal and the collaboration.
It was definitely a time of reckoning. There was this overwhelming sense of relief, of course, but also this profound sense of loss and this real thirst for accountability.
So they wanted to make sure that those who had collaborated with the Nazis were held responsible.
Absolutely. And Quisling, he was at the top of that list.
So he goes on trial.
Yes. In August of 1945, he's brought before a Norwegian court and charged with treason, murder, crimes against humanity. The whole world was watching.
It was a chance for Norway to show that they were serious about justice.
Right. And to send a message that collaboration with the Nazis would not go unpunished.
What was Quisling's defense? Did he admit to what he'd done?
Not at all.
Oh.
He remained defiant. He actually tried to paint himself as a misunderstood patriot.
As if he'd been acting in Norway's best interest all along.
Exactly. But the evidence, it was overwhelming.
So Unsurprisingly, he was found guilty
Yes, on all counts,
and sentenced to death.
by firing squad.
And so Vidkun Quisling, the man who went from fighting famine to becoming a byword for treason, he meets his end on October 24th, 1945. It's a dramatic end to a life that was, full of contradictions, to say the least.
It is, but Quisling's story, it doesn't end there.
Yeah.
His legacy, it lives on not just in Norway, but globally.
Because his name, it's become synonymous with betrayal.
Exactly. A chilling reminder of what can happen when ambition and ideology run amok.
And a reminder of the importance of courage and resilience. Even in the face of unimaginable hardship, the Norwegian people, they never give up hope.
That's the thing that's so inspiring about this whole story. Yes, it's a cautionary tale, but it's also a testament to the power of resistance, the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter the cost, and the enduring belief in democratic values, even in the darkest of times.
Well, thank you for guiding us through this incredibly fascinating and thought-provoking journey.
Yeah.
It's amazing how much we can learn from just unpacking one person's story.
It's been my pleasure. I always say the past may be gone, but it's never truly over. It shapes who we are, how we see the world.
To our listener, if you're interested in learning more about the Norwegian resistance, the individuals who stood up to tyranny, I encourage you to keep digging. You'll find stories of incredible bravery, ingenuity, and resilience, stories that will stay with you long after this deep dive is over.